Hey guys, Chris Jenkins here, and in this video I want to talk to you about the things I don't like so much about drumming. Now, having said that, I'm going to make an obvious disclaimer that obviously I love drums. It's my favorite thing in the world. It's my passion, more than a hobby. It's the thing I just think about every day. It's obviously my life. So nevertheless, I wanted to make a video just going over things that I sort of dislike about drumming, the elements that aren't as enjoyable, just as a way of, I guess, being realistic and trying to make counter arguments and points to all the things that I do love so much about it. So obviously there's going to be some cons, and a lot of these will probably apply to pretty much any musical instrument, but there are a few that I think are a bit more specific to the drums. So let's get into them. Number one is that gear is expensive. Again, I know this applies to most musical instruments, but with drums, I mean, I've said this before, cymbals on average are going to cost you like $300 or more. And even just drumsticks alone, which I think are one of the biggest things, just because it's about $10 a pair. And as a drummer, you're going to break sticks like probably at least every month, if not more often. So that really adds up. It can be a really expensive endeavor. So that's one thing that's not as enjoyable. Again, especially the sticks in particular, because it just happens. You go through sticks, and for me, like going to the music store and buying a bunch of new pairs, it adds up really quickly. Not to mention things like moon gel, just small things that over time degrade, and not even over long periods of time. It just really adds up in the long run. And cymbals, again, like they're something that you're going to break over time, generally speaking, and they tend to be quite expensive, especially for good ones. And that's not to mention drum sets alone. However, you can get cheaper drum sets and still get a good sound just through tuning and acoustics, things like that. In general, the drums are quite an expensive instrument, so that would be number one. Oh, and not to mention electronic drum sets. They are also quite pricey, especially Roland kits, which I'm fortunate to have owned, but again, very expensive. Now, the next one would be the setting up and the pack downs. Oh my God, it takes time. I mean, at this point, I can do it quite efficiently. I would say I can set up a drum set in probably about 15 minutes. Something like that, and I got good experience from doing that on tour, but especially knowing that most of the other musicians don't want to help you or are focused on just packing down their guitars or whatever it is and sort of moving on. Obviously, it's awesome if you do have bandmates and stuff who will help you. You can make that situation happen. You just have to kindly ask. But another thing is you'll probably, as a drummer, know how to pack down and how to set up and to the way you like. So it tends to be something you have to be held accountable for, obviously, and every musician should be. But generally, obviously, the drums take a long time to set up. There's so many pieces of hardware. Everything has to be according to your limb lengths and what you feel comfortable with. It's not as easy as simply strapping on a guitar, putting it on, tuning it. And not to mention, you also have to tune drums as well, or it's advisable because it does make a difference. So not only are you setting up all the toms, the bass drum, the pedals, the hi-hats, all the different cymbals, seat height can even take a bit of time sometimes. Like making sure your sticks are in good places where, you know, if you drop a stick, you're able to recover. Just things like that. It can really take time. And if you're not experienced, I think it could even take upwards of half an hour to longer, especially if you're dealing with a drum mat and all sorts of things like that. Not to mention if you set up and then you have to move it. Oh gosh. So yeah, just setting up, packing down can really take some time. And number three, which relates to this, is the hardware. I mean, drum hardware is obviously designed to be as effective as possible, I guess, but the amount of times like the clamps get really tight and you struggle to unwind them, and when they've been really stiff and then trying to like force them, and you can use things like drumsticks to sort of screw them the other way. But in general, the amount of times I've cut myself and like given myself bruises, things like that, just because hardware can be really annoying and very rigid. It's happened a lot over the years. Not only that, even just cymbals alone. I mean, I've cut myself on cymbals. Maybe you guys have as well as drummers. Drums can be pretty gnarly. And if you've been playing drums for a long time, maybe you can relate to this, but I've very much hit, say, a tom, and then it's fallen out my hand, but rebounded and quite literally hit me in the face. There's been a few times I feel like I could have lost my eye just from that sort of thing. It's not something that happens often, but drum hardware can be kind of dangerous at times, again, because it tends to need to be very heavy duty, and again, clamps and stuff just need to be tight so that things can be held in place, considering you're going to be bashing on them. So drum hardware can just be something that you really have to use a lot of strength with and grapple with at times. Now, number 4, this is mostly a good thing in my opinion, or at least an enjoyable one, but there's definitely ways that it can not be such a great thing, and that is, I guess, what's referred to as drummer syndrome. When you hear music, rhythms, you just have this tendency to tap. I mean, I have this very much so, where if I hear music, and especially music I'm into, it's just almost a subconscious reaction. I just start tapping along and playing, and generally, especially if you're with other people, that can be really annoying to them, and I totally get that, because when I've experienced other people doing that, sometimes I'm like, okay, can you stop? Like, it's kind of annoying. So I totally understand that, and that's just something I feel like can mostly be perceived as annoying by other people, and understandably. It's also something where it kind of maybe takes me out of the song at times, because I'm so focused on the rhythms of the song and trying to imitate them or play over them. I just basically start drumming and not enjoying the music, but at the same time, I guess I am enjoying the music. Yeah, I don't know. This one was a bit of a 50-50, but I just thought it was worth throwing in. Now, number 6, I would say that drums are pretty much one of the most physical instruments. If you've played, obviously you know this to be the case. It requires a lot of swinging and just flailing arms around and using a lot of power. You know, obviously if you're someone like a guitarist, you're mostly just limiting your movement to like your wrists and your fingers. Obviously that's the case with drummers, and I'm not saying that other instruments don't require a lot of energy, especially if you talk in terms of stage presence, but drums are obviously one of the most physical instruments. I think there's even studies showing that drummers burn almost as much, if not more, calories than some top level athletes during a like 90-minute game. I just remember reading something like that. Maybe it's true or not, but the point is you definitely burn a lot of calories playing. Now again, probably just more than any other band member, generally speaking. It also is very much dependent on the kind of music you're playing. You know, maybe if you're just playing with brushes, it's not going to be super physically taxing or exhausting. Obviously there's technique required, and for your fingers and wrists, yes, but for example, something like rock, metal playing, and even most genres of drumming, it can just take a lot of energy. And not to mention, especially when the weather's hot, this is something I have so much experience with, especially in my past apartments that I lived in and played on my electric kit, and being super into metal music, doing things like blast beats all day and double pedal and fast skank beats, just really exerting myself. And especially in a hot apartment or studio or rehearsal space, I just find that generally if I'm in a band rehearsal or something, I'm usually going to be the first one sweating, and I want the aircon on full blast. Everyone else is already like freezing and like, Chris, can you, but I'm sweating, I'm dying, I'm flailing my arms for 2-3 hours. What are you going to expect? It's really physically taxing. So I guess that would be another downside to drumming. I mean, it's a great way to burn calories, no doubt. In fact, as someone who's very much into the gym, that for me has been my excuse for being my cardio. You definitely burn a lot of calories playing drums, especially if you're playing for hours on end. But yeah, I guess that could be another downside. Now, number 7, drums are not a very melodic instrument. I say very because they still are, arguably, especially considering you can obviously tune your toms, for example. You can have, like, Gavin Harrison is a good example of a drummer who has like tons of different splashes with different pitches. Drums are a melodic instrument, but obviously to a very limited extent, and it's not super obvious. So I say this because especially when it comes to things like drum solos, I think you guys already know that listening to just drums on their own can become very boring, especially to the average listener who maybe isn't even a musician. But even for musicians, like listening to a 10 15-minute drum solo probably gets pretty boring about 2 minutes in, unless you have a lot of variation, you are very skilled in sort of telling a story behind the drums. But generally, because it's such a rhythmic instrument as opposed to melodic, it's just something you vibe a bit less with. Maybe vibe isn't the right word, because obviously like the rhythms of it, that's what makes you move and dance, but again, only for so long. People like to be able to hum, to sing to melodies, and that's why, for example, instrumental bands do well when they're extremely melodic. But when it's only rhythm and there's no real melody, then it gets a bit hard to get into after some time, and even a short period of time. You can only do so many cool flashy fills before it sort of has this repetitive feeling to it. So I guess that would be another thing, is that drums can be perceived as a bit of a boring instrument when it comes to long solos, and that's just something I'm very conscious of. So whenever I am told or asked or and put on the spot to do a drum solo, I try to keep it short, try to keep it interesting and show sort of flash and flair, and kind of keep it to that. Again, considering most people who are listening maybe aren't musicians, or even if they are, just don't want to listen to you playing grooves for 10-20 minutes. Now, number 8, this is the last one and probably the most obvious one, but drums are loud. I mean, of course you can turn an amplifier up and play loudly, but the drums, you really don't have an option. You're hitting things, you're hitting metal, for crying out loud. I mean, it's, even when I'm at music stores and I'm trying to test out cymbals, I'm always really self-conscious of making too much noise. And the thing is, when, say, for example, trying to buy a cymbal, you want to hear it at its full velocity. But in doing that, it's just inevitable that there's a lot of decibels involved. It's really loud. So sonically, obviously, a lot of us can relate, where especially if you have things like neighbors and just trying to practice, it can be really hard to do so. Drums are probably one of the only instruments where it can be really difficult to practice and find time and space to practice if you are living with other people. It's something where you have to really compromise and have people be okay with you playing for maybe a certain period of time, because again, relating to the previous point, no one really wants to just listen to someone playing drum fills and grooves all day or for like hours on end, and it's just really hard to avoid. Now, of course, you can get things like V-drums or electronic kits and practice pads, things like that, which are a godsend for us drummers, because again, it allows us to practice without annoying other people. But generally they're really loud. And aside from even just annoying other people, you know yourself that as a drummer, it's loud. Even when you're just playing by yourself and to yourself, you need hearing protection. And if you're not already using some, please do so, because I think a lot of drummers will have a tendency to lose their hearing over time if they don't do that. Again, compared to a lot of other instruments, drums are just really loud. So they're just some less favorable points, I think, to make about drumming as an instrument. Again, having said all this, I obviously love drums. Drums are the coolest instrument. They're so much fun. They're so physical. Almost all these points can be flipped and seen as positive, but for the most part, you know, I just thought, why not actually critique the most awesome instrument in the world. So yeah, they're just some points. Maybe I'm sure you can relate to these. If you have any more things that you'd like to add that you dislike about drums, please put them in the comments. I think this would just be an awesome thread of conversation. As always, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. I'll have a new episode of the Off the Kit podcast coming out very soon, so stay tuned for that. And if you want to see more daily content from me playing drums and doing less talking, then you can check out my Instagram, chrisjenkinsdrums. Again, I upload pretty much daily content there. So until then, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.